Imagine just for a second what it would actually feel like to live in a society that exists in a total, complete vacuum.
Right, like an entirely sealed-off ecosystem.
Exactly. You are living in this meticulously ordered, mist-covered mountain nation, and for over 200 years, your country has just completely hidden itself from the rest of the planet.
Yeah, they called it Sakoku, which basically means chained country.
Chained country. I mean, that sounds intense. And the borders are sealed, like literally sealed under pain of death. There's no foreign books, no outside technology coming
No
in.
geopolitical stress either.
Right. You don't have to worry about what's happening on the other side of the world. It's just this pristine, feudal society. You've got ancient temples, a really refined urban culture in Edo, and the samurai are basically acting as bureaucrats, you know?
Yeah, they were administrators in a very strict social hierarchy.
So to you, sitting there in this society, this isolation isn't some defensive strategy. It's just reality. It's the natural order of the universe.
All you've ever known.
But then on just a totally ordinary summer morning, you look out at the horizon and you see these massive iron-hulled monsters just belching black smoke, moving against the wind.
Which, if you've only ever seen sails, is absolutely terrifying.
Totally. And that shock, that massive psychological fracture, is exactly what we are unpacking today. For you listening, we're doing a deep dive into an incredible historical text. The source explores how Japan went from that isolated island to a massive industrial empire.
And then lost it all in a devastating world war.
Right, only to somehow resurrect itself as a global economic powerhouse. And look, we're not just reading a timeline here. This is a masterclass in how rapid technological adoption can completely rewrite a nation's DNA.
It really is a story about survival at its core.
Yeah, a cautionary tale about the dark side of ambition, too. So where do we even start with this?
Well, the most fascinating thing the source highlights is the sheer speed of this change. You know, we often look at Japan's later imperial aggression as purely militaristic. But originally, every single aggressive move they made came from a profound existential fear.
Fear of what, exactly? Being conquered.
Exactly. Fear of being swallowed by Western imperialism. They looked across the water and saw the British Empire essentially dismantling China.
Oh, wow, during the Opium Wars.
Right. So they realized immediately that the world had been split into predators and prey. And if they didn't want to be eaten, they had to fundamentally destroy their own way of life.
They had to become the predator.
Okay, let's unpack this moment of contact.
Yeah.
July 8th, 1853, we've got Commodore Matthew Perry and the Black Ships pulling up to Japan.
And this wasn't a friendly visit.
No, not at all. A lot of textbooks frame it as this polite diplomatic mission. But, I mean, Perry sails these steam-powered warships right into Edo Bay.
Right into the capital's harbor.
Yeah, and they are heavily armed. They've got explosive shell-firing guns. He basically says, we want a trade agreement, and if you say no, we will level your entire city.
It really was the ultimate ontological shock. It's almost like an alien spaceship landing in your backyard, you know? But instead of lasers, they have a trade agreement and a massive cannon. But wait, here's my question. If this was a society ruled by samurai, these fierce warriors who pride themselves on martial supremacy, why didn't the government just fight back?
Well, that is the existential dilemma the source presents. You have to look at what the samurai actually were by 1853. They hadn't fought a major war in over 2 centuries.
So they were rusty.
Beyond rusty, their military technology was intentionally stagnant. The Japanese coastal defenses were using smoothbore cannons from the 1600s.
Oh, wow. Against 19th century industrial warships.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Fighting would have been suicide. The shogunate knew that a fanatical defense just meant a localized massacre and then complete colonization. They would have become the next India or Southeast Asia.
So it wasn't cowardice, it was just basic math.
Yes, but surrendering to the Americans completely shattered the shogunate's authority. I mean, the shogun's literal title meant commander-in-chief against the barbarians.
And he just let the barbarians park in the driveway.
Right, so for the listener, just imagine what happens when a deeply held worldview is suddenly proven obsolete overnight. It completely destabilized the country.
Which brings us to the internal crisis. The shock of the Black Ships basically kicks off a civil war, right?
It does. The fear of disappearing as an independent nation led directly to the Meiji Restoration in 1868.
And this is where it gets wild. These young reformers take over in the name of the emperor, and they decide they have to destroy the old Japan to save it.
It was a radical overhaul.
They abolish the feudal domains, they dismantle the class system, but the most tragic part of this, according to the source, is the fate of the samurai.
Yeah, Centuries of honor and tradition suddenly just erased.
Replaced by rifles and railroads. But here's where it gets really interesting. How do you tell the fiercest warriors in your society, the people with all the swords, that they are obsolete? Didn't they fight back?
They absolutely did. And the source details the climax of this, which was the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877.
Led by Saigo Takamori, right, the so-called last true samurai.
Yes, and he was actually one of the original architects of the Meiji Restoration. But he became totally disillusioned by how his own class was being erased.
It's so tragic.
It really is. And the reason this rebellion matters historically is because it proved definitively that modern firearms had ended the era of the sword. The new government used a conscript army of commoners with modern rifles and artillery to crush the samurai.
So peasant farmers with guns beat the ultimate martial artists.
Exactly. It was the painful, necessary price of modernization.
Once they put that rebellion down, Japan just goes on this absolute global shopping spree for civilization.
That's a great way to put it. They literally shopped for systems.
Yeah, they didn't just copy one country, they sent people everywhere. They bought the German military model for their army, the British Royal Navy model for their ships.
They took French legal traditions, American educational systems.
They just synthesized the best parts of the Western world.
But, and the source emphasizes this heavily, this creates a massive new problem. We call it the industrial trap.
Right, because if you build factories and steam engines and you put electric lights in Tokyo, which used to be Edo, you need fuel.
You need massive amounts of coal, iron, and oil.
And the Japanese home islands basically have none of those things. It's just a volcanic archipelago.
So this is where the geopolitical reality of the 19th century forces their hand. To be a modern great power, you didn't just need factories. You needed colonies to feed those factories.
Which brings us to the shift to empire. The source has this really striking quote, calling Korea a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan.
Yes, that was the prevailing strategic paranoia.
Because if a Western power, or China, controlled Korea, they had a launch pad right into Japan.
Exactly. Japan felt they had to control that dagger. And that leads directly to the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894.
Which is this ultimate David versus Goliath setup. I mean, China is this massive ancient civilization. Japan is this tiny, newly modernized island.
On paper, China actually had larger, heavier ships built in Europe.
So how did Japan pull off a win?
The text attributes it to the invisible infrastructure of war. Professional training, modern military doctrine, fast steel warships.
So logistics and discipline.
Yes. China's military was plagued by corruption and really poor regional leadership. Japan fought with a unified modern strategy and just dismantled them.
Wow, so they win the war, and they sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. Japan gets Taiwan, the Pescadores, and the Liaodong Peninsula.
They finally get their seat at the imperial table.
But then the rug gets completely pulled out from under them. The source talks about this triple intervention.
Right. Russia, France, and Germany step in immediately.
They basically forced Japan to give the Liaodong Peninsula back to China. So what does this all mean? They win the war, they play by the European rules of empire, and the Europeans just steal their prize anyway.
Exactly.
That has to create a massive cultural resentment, right?
The text highlights this as the exact turning point. It was profound humiliation. It taught the Japanese leadership that modernization wasn't enough. The West was never going to treat them as equals diplomatically.
They realized they had to be ready to actually fight the West.
Especially because, shortly after forcing Japan to give that territory back, Russia just moved in and occupied it themselves.
You have got to be kidding me. That is infuriating.
It was. And that anger leads directly to Japan taking what is arguably the most unprecedented gamble in modern history.
Taking on the Russian Empire. I mean, we're talking about an empire that spans 11 time zones.
A literal giant.
So it's 1904. Japan decides they are not going to wait to be attacked. February 8, they launch a massive surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur.
Without even declaring war first.
Right. And this kicks off the Russo-Japanese War. But the most incredible detail in the source material, the part that just blew my mind, is the journey of the Russian Baltic fleet.
Oh, it is one of the most absurd logistical nightmares ever recorded.
Okay, so the Russian fleet in the Pacific is trapped. So the Tsar decides to send his other fleet, the Baltic fleet, to rescue them. But they have to sail 18,000 nautical miles.
All the way from northern Europe, down around Africa, and across the Indian Ocean.
Imagine driving a broken-down car across the entire globe, running out of gas, just getting absolutely exhausted, only to find a professional racing team waiting for you at the finish line.
That is a very accurate comparison. By the time the Russian ships arrived at the Tsushima Strait in May 1905, they were overloaded with coal, covered in barnacles, and the crews were exhausted.
And the Japanese fleet, led by Admiral Togo, is just waiting for them.
Togo used brilliant modern tactics, like wireless communication and crossing the enemy's T, to just rain highly accurate fire down on the Russians.
And they annihilate the Russian fleet in, what, 2 days?
Basically, yes. It was a total erasure of Russian naval power.
But the global psychological shift is the real story here, isn't it?
Absolutely. The source emphasizes the why here. For the very first time in modern history, an Asian nation comprehensively defeated a major European empire.
That must have sent shockwaves across the whole world.
It did. Across colonized nations in Asia, in the Middle East, it proved that the West wasn't invincible. It gave people hope.
But there is a really tragic irony here, which the text points out. Surviving Western imperialism basically turned Japan into an imperializer itself?
Yes. Their confidence morphed into pride, pride became nationalism, and nationalism calcified into hardline militarism.
Which leads us into this really dark decade. In 1910, Japan formally annexes Korea, and the source is very impartial, but very firm about the realities of this occupation.
It was a systemic cultural erasure.
Right. The text lists out these harsh realities. Banning the Korean language in schools.
Forcing Koreans to adopt Japanese names.
Censoring the press entirely. Now, Japan viewed this as modernization, right? Because they were building railroads and factories.
But as the source notes, for the Korean people, it was the violent erasure of their identity. The infrastructure was built to serve the Japanese empire, not the locals.
We have to state clearly that we are just imparting the facts from the source material here. The text makes it clear this was a deeply oppressive period.
Absolutely. And while this empire is expanding, the Japanese domestic economy is being taken over by these massive monopolies.
This is Zaibatsu, like Mitsubishi and Mitsui.
Right. And they get incredibly rich during World War I, when Japan scoops up German colonies in the Pacific while Europe is distracted.
So they come out of WWI looking like absolute winners. They go to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and Japan proposes this racial equality clause for the League of Nations.
They just wanted the Western powers to formally recognize that non-white nations were equal to white nations.
And the West just flat out rejects it.
Yes, largely due to pressure from the British and the Americans.
Wait, so even after helping the Allies win World War I and building this modern empire, they are still treated as second-class citizens on the world stage?
Exactly.
How much did that fuel what happened next?
The source links this resentment directly to the fallout of the 1929 Great Depression.
Because when the global economy collapsed, Japan's export market died.
People were starving, and the military started blaming the civilian politicians and the wealthy Zaibatsu.
And the military steps in with this really brutal, simple solution. They say, if we can't trade for resources, we will just conquer them.
That marks the point of no return. Economic desperation combined with unchecked military influence.
And it leads to rogue actions by the military, like the Mukden incident in 1931.
Right, where Japanese army officers staged a fake railway explosion in Manchuria.
They blow up their own tracks, blame it on China, and use it as an excuse to invade and create a puppet state called Manchukuo.
And when the League of Nations condemned this action, Japan didn't apologize. They just walked out in 1933.
They just packed up and left the world stage. Diplomacy was totally dead.
The country was walking away from the international community.
And internally, the culture is getting so radicalized. The ancient samurai code, Bushido, gets completely twisted, right?
The source explains how it was corrupted into a modern ideology. It demanded absolute obedience to the emperor.
They sold it as this sacred mission to liberate Asia, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
But it was a framework for limitless expansion, which leads to the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937.
The Marco Polo Bridge incident sparks full-scale war. And following the source text strictly here, this leads to the capture of Nanjing.
Yes, the source discusses this very objectively, noting that while historians debate the exact numbers, there was broad agreement on the scale of the horror.
Hundreds of thousands of civilians and disarmed soldiers were killed.
Along with widespread mass executions and sexual violence.
Again, we are just conveying the facts as presented in our source material, but the text explicitly recognizes this as one of the darkest chapters in modern history.
It was a complete breakdown of humanity, fueled by that twisted militaristic ideology we just talked about.
So Japan is now bogged down in this endless war in China. which means they are burning through oil and steel at an insane rate.
And that puts them on a direct, unavoidable collision course with the United States.
Because the U.S. was supplying most of that oil.
Exactly. In 1941, the U.S. decides to freeze Japanese assets and cuts off the oil supply.
An oil embargo. So Japan's war machine is suddenly on a ticking clock.
They had a choice: submit to U.S. demands and leave China, or seize the oil fields in Southeast Asia by force.
And they chose war. Which brings us to December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor.
Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's massive gamble.
We all know the imagery. The surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Over 2,400 Americans killed. The USS Arizona destroyed. FDR called it a date which will live in infamy.
But the strategic logic behind it is fascinating.
Right, because Yamamoto knew they couldn't outproduce the U.S. in a long war. He had studied in America. He knew their industrial might.
He had no illusions about winning a war of attrition.
So the strategy was basically punch the biggest guy in the room right in the jaw to stun him, take the oil you need, and just hope he agrees to let you walk away.
That was exactly the plan.
That seems incredibly fatalistic.
It was, and the text outlines how quickly that tide turned. Japan had massive early successes taking Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines.
So they woke a sleeping giant. The U.S. industrial engine just roared to life.
And the turning point came just 6 months later at the Battle of Midway in June 1942.
Right, because U.S. codebreakers figured out the Japanese plans. They sprang an ambush.
And they sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day.
It broke the back of the Japanese Navy, and from there, it's just this grueling meat grinder. The U.S. starts its island-hopping campaign.
Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa.
The combat was horrific. The source details these banzai charges, and the kamikaze pilots.
Young men flying planes directly into ships, fighting to the absolute last man.
Because surrender wasn't an option in their ideology, but the math was against them. By August 1945, Japan's cities are being firebombed. The blockade is starving the country.
And then the world changes forever.
The atomic bombs. The Enola Gay drops the first bomb on Hiroshima, followed by a second bomb on Nagasaki.
And simultaneously, as the text points out, the Soviet Union invades Manchuria, crushing the Japanese army there.
It's just complete, absolute destruction from all sides.
Which finally breaks the military deadlock.
August 15th, 1945. The Japanese people hear Emperor Hirohito's voice on the radio for the very first time.
The cultural weight of that moment is immense.
Announcing the surrender. The empire is officially over, signed away in September, aboard the USS Missouri.
But the text makes a point that the story doesn't end in the ashes.
This is the craziest part. Japan is occupied by their allies, led by General MacArthur. They write a new constitution in 1947.
Specifically Article 9.
Where Japan legally renounces war as a sovereign right. They were forbidden from having an offensive military. The emperor becomes just a subtle.
And this connects back to the very beginning of our deep dive.
How so?
Well, you have this society with a relentless drive for modernization, deep societal organization, and intense discipline. For decades, that energy was poured into the military.
Right.
But now, denied a military outlet, where does that energy go?
Oh, wow. They poured it all into the economy.
Exactly. Instead of conquering territories, they set out to conquer global markets.
And they do. Toyota, Sony, Honda, Panasonic. By the 60s and 70s, this utterly devastated nation pulls off one of the greatest economic miracles in human history.
They channeled the exact same survival instinct into consumer electronics and automotive engineering.
It's just an immense journey to wrap your head around. From a mist-covered, isolated mountain nation to a feared military empire to absolute total destruction and then to a global economic titan.
The text really uses this history to show the incredible heights of human innovation and adaptability.
Yeah.
But also, it clearly shows the catastrophic price paid when ambition and pride overshadow the pursuit of peace.
It's a heavy lesson, and it leaves me with this final, really provocative thought for you listening at home to mull over.
What's that?
When a society is forced to modernize out of pure fear just to survive an alien threat, does that trauma inevitably plant the seeds for future aggression? I mean, can a nation ever truly gain immense rapid power without eventually being tempted to use it against others? It's something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.